okay, this is another episode of Thorin's platform, and my guest for this one is going to be stuchiu, and this is going to be a topic which is going to be a Dota2 topic. So obviously people maybe know stuchiu best currently in CSGO because he does a lot of his work there, and traditionally from StarCraft. But like many people who worked in StarCraft, who, at least in your case, you weren't in denial about it.
Yeah.
I've noticed they all have side games, so for as much as they love StarCraft, they all have Dota on the side, or now CSGO on the side, Some of them have even reached the level, thanks to League of Legends, Team Liquid getting a League of Legends team, where they'll even have a League of Legends team on the side, which is just absolutely staggering if you know anything about the history of Team Liquid. But stuchiu, one of his games on the side has been Dota 2, and you wrote an article recently for VP Game, which is one of the new sites you're working for, which is about EternaLEnVy. And the thing about EternaLEnVy that I can immediately tell people about this article, and generally I know about how a lot of people think about EternaLEnVy, it just hasn't properly been sort of codified, it's just sort of like Reddit memes, is that he is one of those guys where, because he himself is a nerd guy who's sunk, whatever, the 30,000 hours into Dota, I'm sure, something ridiculous over his life, some mad amount of time. So he's a really big nerd, and not only a gamer, but a nerd in the sense that he watches tons of anime and all sorts of classic weeb culture like that. He is one of those people where either he's just got the most crazy fortune in life, and his life does play out like an anime plot, which obviously, part of why anime plots are satisfying is they do obey certain rules of storytelling and mythology and how a satisfying story would play out. But part of it, and this is where I want to start this, is there must be a component where he's not even just memeing. Like, in some way, there's a self-fulfilling prophecy component to EternaLEnVy's anime narrative of his career, right? Because he's not just a guy playing a game where he's just had some good results. There is sort of almost like this thread. People used to make the joke, okay. In fact, I think Doublelift himself has referred to this, that he calls himself the protagonist of the LCS. Because if you ever look at the LCS, he was super hyped early on, and then he had the bad teams early, so he had to struggle through sort of the Corby period, where you might be one of the best players, but then people are like, you can't be that good if your team's that bad. But then, eventually he overcome it, became one of the best, it goes through sort of the satisfying character arc, you can't just start at the top. Well, EternaLEnVy kind of has this, right? But I wanted to ask that to open things, okay. How much of it is sort of like self-fulfilling? How much do you think is like he consciously or unconsciously is crafting it this way because he kind of wants a cool storyline rather than just be a guy playing a competitive discipline where you have this result one day and this result another? What do you think?
I think a large part of it is self-crafted. I think just the way he thinks about the game, just the way he plays the game, and even the way he's constructed a majority of his teams play out this way. Like you did an interview with him a long time ago where he basically said he felt like he sold out because he played with Puppy.
Yes.
But like every other roster before that, and even the rosters after that, are basically all have the same thematic theme, which is he's taking a bunch of players that, some of them are good, some of them are great, but majority of the time, a lot of them are unknown before he gets his hands on them, and then he takes that team to the top, because that's how an anime story is supposed to go. You take a bunch of underdogs to the top. You don't join a championship team and then go win.
Yes.
Like that's how he literally thinks, I think.
Yes. So this is one of the bizarre elements that we want to investigate, because it's obviously very compelling. It's so different to almost anyone else in the modern day. Like, for example, it's a famous quality, okay, that especially over the last few years, it first happened when LeBron made that super team with like Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh, but it happened obviously way worse now, because realistically, if that guy from the Golden State Warriors hadn't gotten suspended 2 years ago, they would have just won 3 titles in a row. And now they're even more ridiculous because they have Kevin Durant obviously from last year. So especially in this era, it's been a commonly discussed topic that, like, why do all these superstars want to team up and just win the championship? Because obviously, logically, if you have 2 other very good players on your team, there just isn't enough space for you to put up the numbers you might have put up, or to be the main star, or, for example, to get the maximum credit. Like, the difference is when people discuss Michael Jordan, they can discuss some of his teammates who played a role, but they know he was the main reason, You can't do that when you have these super teams. And so what's bizarre is it's almost, you can see the evolution of thought, because originally people actually weren't doing it, by the way, initially, because it was about pure competition. It was actually about the logistics of how trades worked, and there wasn't as much money in difference to make you want to change from the team you'd played for a long time. There's a lot of other factors, but when it got to the era where you could go anywhere, obviously people initially they'd grown up watching the Michael Jordans of the world, the Magic Johnsons, and then their whole thing is like, by hook or by crook, I want to win a championship. So what happens is, at first they try for whatever team they play for, but eventually, especially if they get frustrated, as is the case in all the ones I've cited there, Kevin Durant, LeBron James, etc., what happens is eventually they sort of think, oh, fuck it, well, I'll just join someone else who's really good and let's just win a championship together. And even though I get it, that there's a logic to, it takes a team and it's, you always have to have contribution from many people. It is true that the people who are judging you in terms of the best players ever, that's going to be a knock on you. Now, what's bizarre about this is, as far as I can tell, EternaLEnVy's like one of the only people I've ever actually seen in esports who thought this way, right? Almost everyone else is the other way around. They think that it's fine. They think like the modern day NBA players I'm talking about. They think it's fine to join a super team. Like if you go and join the team that already has, well, for example, obvious examples are ITZ going, oh, you've won TI with Sumail. I kind of want to win a TI. Can I come and play with him? Which is like, well, if you win that, then RTZ, it doesn't. Here's the problem, okay, which I guess we're going to get into in this topic, is it's a sick storyline. But for example, as I gave in the RTZ one there, the part that they don't seem to understand is, I get the sense that part of what informs the storyline is because they had problems early on. When they had their failures early on, they then think it's like a cheat or a shortcut to take the path to just join the team that's already established. And this is kind of what EternaLEnVy implies, right? In his reinforced storyline, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what EternaLEnVy thinks. Because if you talk to, it doesn't actually matter which game you talk about. Every single player you talk to, they have this weird sense of evaluation of other top players. So, for instance, League of Legends, famously, every all-star vote is just whoever's in the top team at that time in that region.
Yes.
CSGO right now, everybody's telling me top 5 players are Fallen for Coldzera, and then like, what the fuck is this? Like, I don't think that makes sense at all. Like, actually, I only think for and Coldzera would be in the top 5, but that's a different discussion, right? And then in Dota 2, like right after every TI, they're like, oh, who are the top 5 players in the world? It's whoever happens to be in the top 5 team.
Yes.
Or yeah. Whereas like EternaLEnVy, he actually thinks more along the similar lines that I do, in the sense that if you want to win the individual award, you have to do it in a way where there are no caveats, there are no questions as to your own greatness. So you have to put yourself in a disadvantageous situation. And that's basically what he thinks about. It's like, yeah, maybe those guys are the best, but what if I beat them with lesser players? Wouldn't that make me even greater than they are? And that's legitimately how I think every team except potentially the secret team, but even the secret team was very different, was not a true all-star team.
Sure.
Every team he's basically had a hand in has all followed this same pattern.
Because the thing is, to explore that topic a little bit before we go more into like his approach to it, I mean, there is a logic to it. Because actually, if you look at any of the Western teams in the last couple of years who did very well at TI, a lot of them did have a whole bunch. Like, I'm thinking many of the European cores of like OG, and then some of the secret lineups, but the ones before he joined actually, and then Team Liquid actually. They have stacked together a bunch of like good players, and in fact players who've already won before, and in fact players who've won go and play with other players who've won. And so I have to say, to give EternaLEnVy some credit while we build this up, I personally, I'm one of those people who I don't personally think that it's that crazy that some of these guys who, were the ones who were like, I never really won many tournaments for the first 3 years. Well, it's not really that crazy you won them now when you all teamed up with the other guys who were the super fucking mega players, and then you all won them together, Like, that's not really that surprising, is it? Your storyline would only make sense there if you were trying to be like, I didn't win before, but I've gotten a lot better now. If you'd done it with a similar level of teammate and against similar opposition, it doesn't really, there isn't actually a story arc if I go and join LeBron James and we win the championship and he was already the best player. Like, the story arc is, well, yeah, people who play with the best player have the best chance of winning, But it does seem like no one else is thinking this way of EternaLEnVy, because my suspicion here, I want to get your take on it, is, like you say, because there would be no caveats in most of the teams he's been in if he won. Like, if he won, you literally would this might sound bizarre, but you would actually instant be able to make a case for him as potentially the best Dota player of all time. Because if he could really make some of these teams win the fucking international, there is no, well, you played with X or you played with Y. It would be the other way around. It would be like they played with EternaLEnVy. There's a logic to it, right? In a way, I can kind of see his logic, because it would sort of redeem all his past struggles, right?
Yeah, that's almost exactly what I think he's thinking. It's a bit weird trying to get into EternaLEnVy's head because there's almost nobody like him in Dota 2. Just the way he thinks about his own career and the way he plays the game, they're strangely interconnected. But EternaLEnVy is definitely the kind of guy, like, even now, I bet if like I interviewed him, like the first question would be like, the first question and answer would be like, do you still want to be the best player ever? He'd be like, yes. That's still legitimately his biggest concern. And it's not like winning the next title. It's not winning just TI. It's winning the title of the greatest ever. And this is also, and like I said in the article, like anime is one thing, but he is also a guy who did witness the like weird hermetic sort of competition that is Brood War in Korea.
Okay.
And that's like he actually, if you try to find some of his old interviews, he talks about his like level of tryhard, because when he started playing, like all the Dota players were like kind of surprised at how tryhard he was, because he was putting in millions and millions of hours. But then when like he rated himself, he'd be like, I'm only 8.5 out of 10. And then somebody would ask him, then what's 10 out of 10? He's like, oh, that's like Flash or Jadon level. Like that's how he thinks about it. He's like, he wants to win the individual award, but he's in a team game. So it's very like, he makes for a very strange character.
Sure. Okay, so then an aspect about this that I wanted to ask is, obviously, I mean, it's funny because the timing of when I did my reflections with him had to actually exist this way, by the way. Like, I'm sure he wouldn't really care about me saying this, but he actually told me, because I reached out to him before he left Cloud9, I believe. I think it was just before the end of like the last era. And I had already reached out to him before and said, like, let's do an interview about your career or something. And he literally just told me straight up, I won't do an interview until I've won a big tournament. And what happened was, obviously, when he joined that secret team, they very quickly won a couple, you know. So then he was like, okay, yeah, I'll do one now. And so the problem is, when we did the interview, in that moment, he actually had, for once in his career, given up that goal. Like, he'd obviously gone and joined Poppy. And even though this is what I want to get your take on, even if he felt like he, in some sense, compromised, you know, by first of all joining an org that had won things before, and then obviously joining a captain that had been very successful, even so, it also still had a lot of the feel of an EternaLEnVy team, where they were getting in like the guy out of fucking matchmaking, and you know, like it wasn't. He didn't just go and join the champion team, right? So I wanted to get your take on that. What do you think of the secret teams he was a part of?
I think they were overrated at the time, and they're like better evaluated now, because like basically what happens is this happens in every game, where if you do really well in a tournament, it doesn't matter where the roster came from. Everybody's first thought is, oh, that must mean everybody on this team is good. And I don't actually think that was the case for that particular secret team. Like, we came out of nowhere, and I don't actually think we was that good, because he was toiling for like a long time before he joined that team. It just happened that, like, if you look back towards the interviews between Puppy and EternaLEnVy at the time, Puppy gave like carte blanche to EternaLEnVy to make the team. And like the first guy he wanted didn't want to join, and they just picked this other guy, and both of them were like novice players. Basically, none of them had any kind of international success to speak of. And then PyLi, that's actually a very different like question. Like, I know EternaLEnVy highly rates PyLi, but the way PyLi plays, it's actually very EternaLEnVy-esque in that he's extraordinarily good at very specific things, and you need a very specific player to enable that. And so even though, like, I think he was voted MVP for the major that they won, I actually think EternaLEnVy should have won that. But even in PyLi's case, he's not a true all-round player in the same sense that you would give it to like Sumail or Arteezy or How or one of those guys, right?
Sure.
And then the final piece of that puzzle was Misery, and Misery himself, like, he was he's still bouncing around teams all the time, and yeah, he's a good player. He's a flexible player, but he's not necessarily like a guy you would pick to build an all-star team with. So even though he thinks he's sold out, I actually don't think that team, like, put it this way, put that lineup against the former secret lineups, like the true like all-star ones.
Yes.
And those are like 2 or 3 times bigger, like in terms of the amount of name power and skill they had when those lineups were built.
Okay. So one thing, though, that I find actually, I often find this, okay, anytime someone kind of has a narrative that they're telling themselves, you know, they're the ones who came up with it and they're the ones sort of adding to it and reinforcing it. And it's not like an outsider's come up with like, this is a cool thing or, you know, this is what I've kind of gauged. It's them doing it. The problem is that does become the lens that they sort of view everything through. And so, for example, I actually suspect that another part of this is it's kind of like that thing where, this will sound weird, but one of the reasons why a lot of people will never go all out in practice, for example, a pro player, or they will never do 100% extra, like above and beyond, like demo watching and studying opponents and analyzing and trying to scout them and stuff. One of the reasons why people won't do that is the same reason why someone might say, like, oh yeah, I'm pretty good at like art or whatever it might be, but I just don't have time to do it more. It's because they actually obviously fear that if they do it 100% and then they realize, oh, actually, I thought I had all this hidden potential and I thought I would be the best if I try harded and does, you know, then I would be the ultimate one. So this might sound counterintuitive because obviously, as you're saying, in a way, actually, he's the one who truly is testing himself to the fullest extent in some way that some of the other players aren't. But I also wonder, and obviously I don't know enough about Dota to answer this is why it's a question, is I do also wonder, but after watching all the teams that he constructed, they do all, it doesn't matter who is in the teams. He can have totally different players in the lineup. They all play his style of Dota. If they're good, they all play his style of Dota. It's almost like they have to, and he has to play the most classic EternaLEnVy style, which everyone knows is very chaotic, and at any moment you can lose the whole game, or you can be in a terrible situation, but win that like in amazing fashion, you know? And somehow they all do end up like that. And so part of me wonders, is this like a way for him to justify not joining another team that were very successful, but in which he would have to change as a player, or he'd have to be just a role player, or could be a star player, but, you know, maybe he has to have a captain who's going to tell him what to do, because he does seem like someone who wants to have a lot of autonomy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, every protagonist has to have their own free will, so to speak. And in EternaLEnVy's case, it might have actually had, I think he always had to go down this route. Because when we talk about Dota 2, it's completely different from, I'd say it's completely different from both CSGO and League of Legends, which are the other two like team games I've been watching. Sure. Or I guess Overwatch 2, in the sense that among all those games, Dota 2 loves its captain the most. And what I mean by that is the success of a particular team follows its captain rather than follows its like all-star. The only exception to this might be How, and that's it. Like no other like all-star like gets like a bunch of players around him. It's only How that does it.
I'll give you the context for everyone who's listening who doesn't follow Dota. Like here's the ultimate context to give you the contrast to CS:GO that'll show you how skewed it is. So obviously in CS:GO we have the problem which goes the other way around, which is that as soon as like a captain loses his stars, for example, like most obvious examples are like Pronax and Happy, people will make out like, oh, he was never that good anyway. It was just Olaf Meister carried Pronax, and you know, like they'll act like that. But here's all you need to know. I have heard many credible people say that they think that the clear best player in Dota 2 for this year was Kuroki. Now, the reason why that is bizarre is because part of why they're doing it is because of the feel-good narrative that finally he won the big one, right? But if you look at him winning the big one, he did take what was essentially many people's consensus best Dota player for last year and just add him as his star player into his team. So while I definitely don't think you got to go one way or the other, to me, there's clearly like a relationship there, and you know, it depends team to team as to which way I would kind of grant more credit, because it's kind of, there's a lot of nuance. But the point you're making, which is a key one, is that yes, as I pointed out here, they kind of use the logic that since the team captain brings the team together somehow and it constructs some of the elements, somehow to give you, this is the contrast, they would be crediting Fallen each time Coldzera MVP carries them to a tournament win and go, well, you know, he's the one who set it up and made that possible, which is very different to the other games, right? So how does this work in the context of EternaLEnVy?
Basically, if every Dota player thinks about it in the same way, and it might actually come down to just the practicalities of learning Dota 2 compared to the other games. Like League of Legends has coaches, or some of them do. In CSGO, yeah, you're learning basic stuff from the leader, but eventually you're going to get a guy who's going to figure out what the leader is doing and like ride that for a little bit. Or even if you like kick the leader, like in the case of Pronax, you can like still use the hangover effect.
Sure.
and like still live off of that. If you do that in Dota 2, you're dead because of the way the patches work and the way the meta changes and the amount of heroes and information that's like going around throughout the entire meta game, because there's way too much like minutia just in terms of the items of heroes, of how they interact in the lanes, of how to like lane swap, all these different like minor things, and drafting and stuff like this, right? And so what would happen is if EternaLEnVy ever actually ceded control, then he'd have to accept that he might not be the primary cause for why his team is winning. And so not only is he like obviously one of the great players, but he's also, I think, the only top leader that's also a core player. And that's part of like why his gameplay is so like tied to this weird story arc of him thinking he's an anime hero or something.
Yes. Because the bizarre thing is, again, obviously I'm going to have to reference CSGO for this, because first of all, in Dota, it is pretty common that all the supports are the great leaders, you know, and there's a lot of logic as to why. But in CSGO, if you think of any of the teams in the last couple of years where it was like a superstar player who had to just be the in-game leader as well, you know, out of necessity, it's a very good contrast to EternaLEnVy being the captain of so many of these teams, because like you think of when Shox had to be the captain of G2, but last year when it was just him screaming, he was sort of like, it was like having like a garage without all the tools and being like, right, I've got to figure out some way to fix this shit. So whatever the best tools are, that's all we're going to use. You know, we're just going to find a way to whatever it is. It's going to use a hammer and a wrench. You know, I don't have the drill or whatever it might be. So obviously he had to call the whole game around himself. Stewie 2K, when he took over in Cloud9, he had to call the whole game around himself. Whenever these players do that, it does seem that they will have a strength, which is obviously they have this star player, and the problem is it looks typically like the star player, because he's played as a star player so long, his only way to succeed is he has his own little world, which is like, this is what I do and I'm good at this, so let's do these things. And his problem tends to be, I've noticed, when you expand that to the whole team, because he's still thinking about himself because he's the star player, you end up living on the strengths of the star player, and sometimes it'll look amazing, but then whatever the star player's flaws are just become the entire team's flaws, you know. So as great as the G2 Shox team was, as fun as the Cloud9 Stewie 2K was, they were never going to go further than certain flaws of those captains. So this seems like it sounds like a very loaded question, but surely EternaLEnVy teams are like this, because like I say, you can even change all the other players. You can do the Theseus boat approach and it's still an EternaLEnVy team, right?
Yeah, even in like the one case when he wasn't captain with Puppy, that team still played like an EternaLEnVy team. And EternaLEnVy had like the biggest hand in the lineup, right? And it still ended up playing like an EternaLEnVy team. And this is just the way he thinks about the game. And it's like, it's...
So outline it then. How do you define an EternaLEnVy approach to the game?
Okay, an EternaLEnVy approach to the game starts with... All right, basically, if you want to think about... I have to first explain this principle, I guess. In games that have a bunch of patches and meta shifts, and not just meta shifts, but like patches that like change the way the entire game is played. So I'll name a few: League of Legends, Overwatch, Dota 2, StarCraft 2. In games like this, you have to break it down. There's a certain principle where one's called form and the other is called substance. And the form is basically like the practicalities of the way the patch plays out. So like Broodlord Infestor would be an obvious one, where it's like, oh, because this is so overpowered, you have to use it. But like the substance is strategic or overall ideas that like completely shift the way somebody can think about the game, right? And in EternaLEnVy rosters, basically, I'd have to it basically shifts around both his play style and the way he thinks about the game. Like, this is a guy who he was the first one to think about stacking neutral camps to farm gold, right? And to explain that more, it's basically he's creating gold out of nothing except through effort. And this ends up like expanding towards everything about Dota 2. And no patch can like take it out unless they completely shift the way the respawns work for jungle camps. And that's like that's him changing the substance of the entire game rather than like changing changing his game around the form of the game, so to speak. And despite Eternal Envy playing for like 4 or 5 years or however long it is, the substance of all of his games are similar, even though the form changes. So basically, he always picks these idiosyncratic players. Like obviously he was I think he was the guy who found Bulldog, who could only play like 3 heroes, right? That was him. And then he gets kicked out of No Tidehunter. He goes to and builds Kaipi, I think. And then you have Sing Sing, who also can only play 3 players. You have Bone 7, who was like feed or win, basically, but mostly just die. You have Pilot Die, whose nickname is Die Die Die. And you have like AUI, who had he was also a substance player, but it was like very specific type. Like he was also another guy who created gold out of nothing from his role in order to win the games. And basically those are Eternal Envy things, where an Eternal Envy lineup will always try to push the meta in weird ways that nobody else can like theorize, because he himself puts in a lot of work and theorizes a bunch of these things. But it's also the case that he focuses on efficiency more than like fights. And what I mean by that is like, it doesn't matter how good your team fight is if the other team has a bunch more items, right? Okay. Or a bunch more levels, or whatever resource he's going through. And that's like part of his gameplay style. So like his Drow Visage, the Drow Visage, the Terrorblade, the Skeleton King kind of works like this. Doom kind of works like this. But then there's the other part of his style, which is this weird chaotic style, which he's much more famous for, and the reason why everybody loves watching him. And it's this like situation where in any other team, they would probably just give up in those particular situations, or they wouldn't put like their 100% into it. Whereas like you put Eternal Envy into a shit situation, like famously at Summit, like Sumail made the joke, oh yeah, 2 racks down, this is actually Eternal Envy's power spike. Like this is the time when he goes ham. And like it goes from a joke into reality a lot more times than not, because at that point, every single, like, I don't know what happens to him, but like he legitimately finds like the hardest, like the only route to survival and the only route to victory. And he becomes super decisive at that moment, and that's when his calling and that's when his play style goes really crazy. And that's generally why when you think about Eternal Envy moments, all of his heroes are these high farm, high mobility heroes, because it allows them to get the items and allows them the mobility to create these chaotic plays where situations should be lost, but he's like pulling out bullshit that like nobody could even think of. Like there was this TI game, TI5, where he's playing against LGD, and LGD is basically doing the Chinese thing. They're rolling down the lane and they're pushing down mid racks, and then what happens is like Bone 7 basically said, "Oh, I thought we lost this game." But then Eternal Envy comes in and he says, "Oh, guys, I took their bomb racks." We're like, "What the fuck?" Apparently, and they were down like 30,000 gold, but he like basically bullshitted. Like he got a Divine Rapier and he's basically just went in and went ham and like stole the game, or yeah, he stole that game basically, or like he made it so that it was actually possible to win. And that's like the Eternal Envy special, is where a game is going, like he said this on the Summit, where when a game is going so bad, you cannot play a standard game anymore, because if you play a standard game, both sides realize that you are in a losing position and that you will lose. Yeah. Whereas if you create a chaotic game where nobody understands Dota anymore, then that's much better for you. So it's much better to do these suicidal, crazy, all-in type moves, because in those situations where neither side knows what Dota is anymore, you have a chance to win. And this is the hallmark of an Eternal Envy team, is if he gets into a situation where he's down like 20, 30K, where he's down 2 racks, but he knows like win a victory objective. He knows that if he can get a certain like misplay from the other team, or if he can create a misplay from the other team, he can steal the win anyway. And not only is it like a hallmark of his teams, it's actually a hallmark of his calling, and arguably like a hallmark of like why he probably legitimately thinks he's like an anime character or something, like,
okay,
because that's the only way that's like his most famous victories are all come from behind victories.
Okay, so the bizarre thing about this though is that, like, if we're outlining this here, and in fact, if anyone goes and watches these games, what's bizarre is they'll probably think from these games, like, holy fuck, this guy must be one of the most clutch players ever. Like, his ability to do this is amazing. Because usually that sort of a comeback and that kind of will to win it's a characteristic of, you know, the incredibly clutch players. But what's bizarre is EternaLEnVy's teams have had some of the worst letdowns in the history of Dota with consistency. You know, if you were to make like a top 20 team games that were like lost, where you were like, fuck, this is going well, he'd be all over the list. So
yes,
is there some sort of a flaw in EternaLEnVy that contributes to this?
Like, I actually think like part of the reason he's so good at calling lost games is because he's so good at losing won games, if you get what I mean. Because he understands like the flip side of that equation. He understands how easy it is to lose, and he keeps doing it. And I don't know why he keeps doing it, because he can't really explain it. Like, because it's not like it's not like all of these losses are in high pressure situations where you're like, oh, they're chokers, right? Like a lot of them are, granted, but there's a bunch of games where like his teams lose, and it's not like it's an incredibly important match. They just throw away like 40k gold leads and then die, and it's really bizarre because he is simultaneously like a choker and a clutch player at the same time in a way like I have never really seen before. Because it's not like he's it's not necessarily like he always like does one or the other at any given point, but you don't really know why he's doing one or the other at any given point. Like, what's the trigger, right? Like, except for like TI, where like the pressure is humongous. Like every other tournament, like you can't really you don't really know what an EternaLEnVy lineup is going to bring you, and it's probably why like he's so popular among just people who randomly watch the games, is because there's no, in an EternaLEnVy lineup, there's no lead unthrowable, but simultaneously there's no comeback unattainable for his teams too.
Okay. So as kind of a closing topic then, what I wanted to ask was this, is that if we're going to talk about this guy and the way he sees himself, we also have to look outside of his subjective view at what players he played with, what opportunities he had, because obviously you can only judge actually someone's play and how great they were based on, you know, what opportunity did they have, how could they have succeeded, did they have the right players with them. And I have to say, one area that has always made this, I agree with how appealing the narrative is, and I've always liked it, is that it does look like he has gone the hard approach in all respects. Like, if you look generally at the players that were playing for the teams we're talking about, the ones that didn't win with EternaLEnVy, those players generally have not had a lot of success outside of EternaLEnVy's teams. And even if some of them have been part of winning teams, that was often brief, or they weren't necessarily the main part of it, you know. Generally, in a way, I'm not even sure that his approach failed largely because of him. Like, in some ways I can see that, like, in this sense, okay, he reminds me a little bit of MSL from CSGO. It's like, as much as you can clearly see all his weaknesses, every weakness is tied to a strength that actually makes his teams maybe better than another player in his position would have had them, you know. So as bizarre as it sounds, you critique them in an absolute sense, like, you know, against the best players ever, but part of you, when you look in isolation, it kind of makes sense where the guys end up, you know. I always feel like if you get enough chances and you have the full control, you kind of get what you deserve in a way.
Mm-hmm. So basically, when we're talking about like EternaLEnVy's, I guess if you want to think about it, there's a concept called bounded rationality, and what that is basically people can make rational decisions, but only based off of like certain circumstances they're given. So like, you can't make the absolute rational decision in a given circumstance because you don't have all the information, or you don't have enough time to make it. So what you do is, given the circumstances you have now, what can you do with what you have now? And then if you end up with like a satisfactory result or a good result, when you end up in the same situation again, you end up doing the exact same solution again. So you talked about MSL, right? And basically that's like MSL's big weakness, is he ended up in the same problem continuously as being like a tier 2 like Danish team that was farmed.
Yes.
And so he kept coming to the same solution every time, and at some point he eventually like outpaced the circumstance he was put in. He's like one of the only guys I've ever seen do it, where like his team, he got so good at the solution that he bypassed the problem entirely, and now he's in a new set of problems. But he's
I'll give you an analogy. Okay, actually, this just happened. This is going to be a bit abstract because it's not perfect, but this actually just happened to Faker at the World Championship, which is that if you actually watched the way his team played, they had no business even getting to the semi-finals and then getting to the final. But because he actually did one of the only things he could in his world, his realm within the game do, he allowed them to get to the finals, at which point he then ultimately failed, and then people will then say, oh, look how badly he did in the final. It's like, what's weird is being so good at the part before put you in a position to fail worse. So as you're saying here, with someone like an MSL, the point is no one ever had the expectation he was going to be in the number 1 team or win a massive championship, So when he actually solved, the hell that he was stuck in and got out of it, in a mad way, he's put himself in a position to be open to more criticism. So this ties into Eternal Envy, right?
Yeah, this is exactly like Eternal Envy's problem is, after he gets kicked from No Tidehunter, right? He basically comes to the conclusion that he doesn't really have enough sway as a leader. Actually, I don't know if he comes to that conclusion exactly, but I know for certain that like a bunch of Dota 2 players probably didn't think he was that good. And even when he looked back at his time in No Tidehunter, he probably came to the same conclusion. He wasn't that good as a support, and that's why he switched over to carry or a core. And so he basically had to take a bunch of guys that were underrated and had very specific strengths. And if he had to utilize those strengths in order to like become a great team. And he's basically been in this like same cycle over and over and over again. And he's been unable to figure out the final step because he keeps going to the exact same position, right? Except for like the NP team last year. And even then, like when he like got the band back together, so to speak, he ended up in the exact same situation. And then he used the same solution. And then he ended up like getting like a second and a fourth and then bombing TI again, right? Like, so it ended up being the exact same cycle. And that's Eternal Envy's like weird sort of purgatory is he found himself in an impossible problem. He found a solution that worked, but now he puts himself into a new problem because that's kind of how competition works. And he thinks it's similar enough to the old problem. Like if I do the same thing, maybe it'll work out this time, but it doesn't.
Sure.
So that's kind of like in a strange sense, like MSL and Eternal Envy have like a same philosophical problem with their approaches, but because it was so good, like I don't think either of them are likely to let it go.
Yes.
And that's kind of like that's kind of both of their problems because like even now when you look at like Eternal Envy's team, like the Fnatic team when he went to SEA, yeah, there's legitimately like good skilled players, but beyond a few lineups, and even those lineups have mostly been like underdog lineups or like on a good day lineups, like not necessarily championship winning lineups. They've never had like a guy be able to make them a consistent team. And this is basically like even though Eternal Envy's basically put himself in SEA, this team is very similar to these other old teams where like there's idiosyncratic players. There are players that haven't really like risen to that level of play before. And he took Pile Die with him. He's the leader. And even these players that are playing under him, they're learning from him rather than him learning from them still. So he's basically stuck in a very similar situation. The only difference is that because he's moving to SEA as a region, he has to learn their meta, so to speak. And their meta is very different from the way like Eternal Envy plays the game. So I'm not exactly sure what the hell is going to happen as like time goes on if he stays here long enough, because like SEA as a region in Dota 2 is very similar to how CIS was before, like after the Puppy Kuroki departure and before Solo took over, where you have a bunch of skilled players, but they're stuck in like the exact same meta, and you have to have a guy who's able to like control their bad impulses but exaggerate their benefits. That's basically what Solo's done with BP right now, and that's basically what basically the question that EternaLEnVy has to have, because he isn't a guy who does that necessarily. He's a guy who like enforces his style of play onto the players, or maybe they all end up thinking he's the correct person. He's the guy who has the answers. So I'm not exactly sure how this like influence will work out for EternaLEnVy, but that's basically like his problem, is he's ran into the same loop over and over again.
Okay, so the last question I have is this. It's obviously the $1 million question, isn't it? Because there's no real answer, it's just your answer to it. So the $1 million question is, if EternaLEnVy keeps doing this approach and he does make it work, despite flaws and the things that people have criticisms of, and the easy ways, frankly too easy, where people can just look at the team that won and sort of be like, why not just do what they did, which it's kind of a bit cheap, if you're not an actual player. If he was able to do it, if somehow he took an EternaLEnVy type team and he really did win TI, whenever it is, we'll even say he could do it in 5 years to just say something could change in the game, If he does do it, would it kind of justify the story and the narrative and his philosophy? Would it for you somehow be like an ultimate redemption? And even though, it's not like winning 3 TIs, to win one your way has a kind of charm to it, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it does. There are very few players that can enforce their individuality, their skill onto a team or onto an entire scene. And EternaLEnVy is like one of the few players that in the modern day still does that. So even though like he doesn't have a bunch of championships, he does have a shitload of second places and third places. And he has taken a bunch of these like lesser players and made them greater than the sum of their parts. And if he does win this theoretical TI one day, it will be because of him. It will be because of him as a player or him as a leader. And that's kind of like, that is the redemptive quality, because if he's able to do that, like he basically forces like, how do I exactly say this? He basically forced Dota2 to bow to him rather than him bowing to Dota2. That's the way I put it. For at least one tournament or one TI, he'd be able to do that, and I think that's an achievement in and of itself, even though it's not necessarily like the achievement that he probably wants, which is like greatest of all time player. But it's a very specific achievement, and it's one that very few players, even some of the greatest of all time, have been unable to do.
This is PPD. You guys are watching Thorin's YouTube channel. One of the only men with a bigger ego than even myself.